Okay, range rights were recognized under state and territorial laws and the courts. And this goes all the way back to Mexican and Spanish law. The law that was enacted to recognize range rights in the beginning was called Kearny's Code. I'll just talk about it just very briefly. But Stephen Watts Kearny was commander of the Army of the West, which was the army that went from the United States to California through New Mexico and Arizona, from starting in Kansas during the Mexican-American War. And if you look at the records and the history of the Mexican-American War, about 99% of the casualties during that war of the United States was down in Mexico, between the coast and Mexico City, because that's where all the fighting was. Now, there were a lot of settlements in New Mexico and southern Arizona and California of the Mexican people that were living there, Mexican citizens. But as soon as Kearny came into Santa Fe, the very first thing he did was he sat down with the people and he said, we're going to develop a law. We're not here to take anybody's property rights. We're not going to affect anybody's property rights. And because he told them that, and they actually put together what's called Kearny's Code, and that actually became the law and governed the territory that they had just taken possession of from Mexico. And in that code, they said, we will respect all of these property rights. And on page 71 is where they addressed water rights. And later, the U.S. Supreme Court, on at least 3 different occasions, said that Kearny's Code was as valid as any act of Congress, that General Kearny was the legislative, executive, and judicial branch of government under martial law, and that the Kearny's Code was valid law. As a matter of fact, you can look in the revised statutes for the state of New Mexico, and it's still there today. It is still valid law in the state of New Mexico. So, and Kearny's Code covered all the area that was then covered by the Mexican claims. Okay, so it didn't cover the Oregon Territory. But later Supreme Court decisions said that the prior appropriation doctrine was the doctrine and the custom and the culture of the Mexican people before the cession, and that law continued in effect. And then in 1866, because the states that were not covered by that area, such as Montana and Oregon and Washington and Idaho and parts of Wyoming, had adopted the prior appropriation water doctrine. And so in 1866, when Congress enacted the Act of July 26, 1866, the Supreme Court said that that act had recognized the prior appropriation water doctrine. Then in 1976, that's not ancient, 1976. Now, some of you young people might think so, but you know, a lot of us here were born before 1976. I want to tell you that. So it's not ancient law, but in that year, in a case called California versus U.S., Rehnquist, writing for the majority, said that the Act of 1866, 1870, and 1877, the Desert Land Act, had severed all the water west of the 100th meridian from the land and made that open to appropriation by private citizens. And in these same states, as a matter of fact, California, one of the very first acts of its state legislature after it became a state in 1850 was to reenact as state law the prior Mexican range laws, which were called the Jueces de Campo and the Rodeo laws, which were their range laws. And of course, those laws came from what was called the Mesa Ordenanzas, which was the Mexican range code that existed in Mexico and governed all of their territory up from beginning in I believe it was, I want to say 1536. So that custom and culture was in place for hundreds of years before the United States took over that part of the country and took it by conquest from Mexico. And so when General Kearny reenacted, basically he put his stamp of approval, and it's on page 71 of Kearny's code, where they actually recognized all the laws heretofore in force concerning water courses, brands, commons, enclosures, and so forth. So, and I've got the actual quotes in my dissertation, but if you wanted to look that up, you can find a citation to find it. It's on page 71 of Kearny's code.